They ruled for centuries, but some truths were never meant to escape the palace walls. Welcome to Echo Slumber. I am your host, Arlen Graves. Drop a comment. Tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight. Your words help uncover what history tried to bury. Let's begin. Beneath the soaring domes and golden crescents, behind the latticed windows of palaces and the dusty silence of forbidden archives, the Ottoman Empire held secrets it never intended the world to see. It was an empire of shadows and splendor, where silence was power and knowledge was a guarded flame. Some truths were locked away behind veils, behind calligraphy too sacred to question, or buried beneath tiles glazed in mystery. This is not a tale of battles or borders, but of what was hidden and why it was never meant to surface. As we travel through the marble corridors of memory, we'll trace not what was said, but what was silenced. In a world where stories were inked in secrecy, we now read between the lines. And as always, know that we truly love and care for you, wherever you may be tonight. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now grab your coffee and let's get started. They say the Ottomans ruled with sword and script, but those who whispered this rarely knew the softest and strongest weapon in the empire's arsenal, the veil. Not the one worn by courtiers or concubines, but the veil of concealment. Draped delicately over the truths the world was not meant to see. It was not stitched with thread, but with intention. It fluttered not in the wind, but in the hush of withheld knowledge, guarded silences, and carefully timed revelation. Before armies were sent, before treaties were signed, before coins were minted or towers raised, there was always the decision: what must the world never know? From the first rise of the crescent above the Bosphorus, when Mehmed the Conqueror rode through the breached walls of Constantinople, the empire understood a simple, eternal truth. Control did not lie only in power but in privacy. The right to hide upkeep and the skill to do it well became as sacred as the right to rule. And so the curtain fell, not all at once, not with ceremony, but slowly, intentionally, a curtain between the throne and the truth, between the subjects and the records, between the distant observer and the hidden architect. It began with architecture. The Ottomans built palaces like puzzles, spacious, glittering, and deceptive. The layout of Topkapi was not just a matter of aesthetics, but a matter of surveillance. Courtyards bled into chambers, chambers into corridors, each step drawing a guest further from the centre of truth. The deeper one ventured, the less they understood. What seemed open was not. What looked symmetrical was deliberately uneven, and some doors led nowhere at all. Even the gardens, lush and adorned with fountain, whispered of secrets. A guest might walk among tulips without ever realizing that a sultan was watching through a latticed window, above, unseen. It was an empire designed to be admired, but never quite understood. And so, the act of hiding became art. The Ottoman Empire understood what many kingdoms never dared to learn. Mystery was not weakness, it was protection. What could not be seen could not be copied. What could not be verified could not be challenged. In this way, the empire preserved itself through subtraction, not addition. Even their language obeyed the curtain. Ottoman Turkish was not spoken in the streets. It was not the tongue of bakers or boatmen, not the lullaby of mothers to their children. It was a linguistic palace in itself, constructed from Persian elegance and Arabic sacredness. It was the private code of the elite. And because of that, it separated the rulers from the ruled. Laws could be written, poetry could be praised, records could be altered, and the common man would never know. The curtain of the script was invisible, but absolute. Inside the palace, the harem was not the space of indulgence Western imaginations often believe. It was a world of veils within veils, political marriages, succession strategies, alliances stronger than any battlefield negotiation. All were brokered within those marbled rooms. but the outside world was rarely permitted to know the names of the women who shaped history from behind embroidered screens. And what is hidden is not remembered, at least not easily. Consider the archives. While the empire was diligent in its records, thousands of documents meticulously stored and organized, certain files vanished without trace, orders destroyed, agreements silenced, entire sections of imperial correspondence left without conclusion. Why were some documents preserved in gold script while others faded under suspicious mold and fire damage? Why were certain imperial edicts recopied centuries later, while others were never again mentioned? A curtain is not just fabric, it is a filter. It allows light through in strands. It lets warmth in, but only a little. And the Ottomans mastered the curtain as an idea. There is something tender about how well they did it. They never boasted of their secrets. They never published them in memoirs or paraded them in museums. They simply closed the door, gently, firmly, and waited for time to do the rest. Sometimes a whisper would escape, a foreign ambassador's frustrated report, a strange manuscript appearing in a Parisian collection, a traveller's vague description of a building no one else could find. These were the moments the curtain shifted ever so slightly, not enough to reveal, only to remind the world that it was there. Tonight, as we walk softly across time's polished floors, we must remember that the most powerful empires do not always shout. Some rule by omission. Some shape history by erasing the parts they fear, will echo too loudly. The Ottoman Empire was many things: conqueror, creator, protector of scholars, punisher of dissent. But above all, it was an artist of absence. It knew that to hide something well was to let it live longer. So here, where sword met silence, where marble walls heard more than they ever spoke, we begin, not with a chronicle, but with a curtain. Not with what was said, but what was not. And as the stars settle gently over the spires of old Istanbul, and the Bosphorus winds its ancient lullaby past forgotten fortresses and closed gates, we lie beneath the hush of that great veil and wonder what still waits behind it. Within the layered silence of Istanbul's imperial heart, where domes glinted like polished pearls and minarets leaned into the sky, there was another kind of monument, quieter than stone, older than law, the library. It did not rise above the skyline, it whispered beneath it. In the grand courtyards of Topkapi Palace, where the scent of jasmine tangled with damp parchment, stood libraries that held not just knowledge, but decisions. Bound knowledge, restricted knowledge, some truths inked in gold leaf, others hidden behind blank bindings and silent catalogues. There were shelves that no librarian dusted, doors that opened only for men with names etched in royal permission. And here, beneath the calm hush of memory, our footsteps begin. They called them Mutaferrika scrolls, volumes printed by the empire's early presses, bearing science, mathematics, maps and reflections from beyond Ottoman borders. The press was a miracle when it arrived, but not everyone welcomed its arrival. With printing came duplication. With duplication came danger. For in the wrong hands, even a treatise on celestial bodies could become political. So the empire gave birth to two kinds of books, the kind you read and the kind you protect from being read. In special cabinets of red cedar, fragrant, dark, immune to rot, texts were stored and wrapped in muslin. Some bore no title on their spines. Others were labelled with symbols only a handful could decipher. Not because the Ottomans were careless, but because they were careful. What could be misread could become rebellion. What could be reinterpreted could unseat a minister. And so certain texts were entombed in fabric and time, guarded by ritual rather than readership. Some rooms were colder than others, by design, not for preservation of the paper, but for the slowing of human breath. The fewer people who lingered, the fewer hands would reach. In these corners, it was not rare to find a copy of a translated Latin manuscript, say, a 13th century treatise on astronomy, placed high above eye level. ladder removed, a gentle form of denial, not a ban, just out of reach. And yet, some of the most dangerous knowledge came not from outside, but from within. Records of political dissent, journals of banished poets, philosophical treatises that asked uncomfortable questions of the divine and the earthly. These too were kept, not destroyed. That would leave too loud a silence. Instead, they were kept locked, catalogued under generic titles like Miscellaneous Reflections or Notes on Ethical Thought, enough to obscure, never enough to forget. There is one room, or so the old palace keepers say, known unofficially as the Mirror Vault. It held not only books, but annotations, reflections of reflections. Every work copied, not in its original hand, but through the lens of a state-sanctioned scribe. Footnotes adjusted, interpretations softened. Some versions bore passages that had no precedent, others were missing verses known to have existed. This was not clumsy censorship, this was artful rearrangement. In one instance, a manuscript of Ibn Sina's medical writings was found to have entire sections omitted on female anatomy. In another, a European alchemical text was preserved, but with key formulae altered, not to protect Ottoman secrets, but to prevent the reader from discovering someone else's. What did the empire fear in such pages? Not revolution in the streets, but transformation of thought. The Ottomans were not strangers to scholarship. They supported astronomers, architects, and linguists. But there was a difference between nurturing knowledge and sharing it unfiltered. A single idea, if introduced too early or too widely, could unravel the rhythm of tradition. And so the state became not only a patron of learning, but its curator, its editor, its quiet censor. To ensure this, the palace libraries were overseen by Kitafan Nazırları, custodians trained not just in preservation, but discretion. They knew which scrolls were to be displayed, and which ones whispered of forbidden truths. They signed oaths, not of protection, but of silence, and yet despite the curtain drawn over these books, they breathed. Dust settled, yes, but ink does not die. A curious servant might copy a passage and carry it into the markets of Galata. A diplomat, waiting for an audience, might glimpse a forbidden volume through a half-open door. A scholar, promised access to one manuscript, might find another, tucked behind it. The books found ways to speak. In the 19th century, a British traveller reported seeing a text in the Imperial Archives that contained illustrations of anatomical studies, delicate, accurate, clearly influenced by Renaissance Europe. But when he inquired further, he was told there was no such book. Days later, the shelf it occupied was bare, and still, that traveller described it in his journal, and that journal survives. This is how hidden libraries speak, through misplacement, through memory, through contradiction. Not all books are dangerous because of what they say. Some are dangerous because they remind us there is more to know. And now, centuries later, some of those shelves remain locked. Not out of fear, perhaps, but out of habit. Bureaucracies long outlived the fears that birthed them. There are rooms in Istanbul where no one has turned a key in decades. Scholars request access. Committees review. The answer is always not yet. But in the quiet of those vaults, wrapped in cloth and shadow, the stories wait. They do not hurry. They do not fade. They wait for eyes patient enough to read softly, and minds calm enough to understand without fear. And as we leave the corridor now, past the stained glass windows and mosaic floors, we do not carry books with us, but we carry questions, and sometimes that is heavier. Tomorrow we will walk further, into the parts of the palace where voices were shaped into silence, and silence into law. But for now, let your thoughts drift through corridors lined with unread wisdom, and shelves that still remember every hand that touched them. They moved where others could not, through archways of carved stone, along tiled floors that remembered every step but told no one. Dressed in black, sometimes in white, sometimes in quiet shades of dusk, the eunuchs of the Ottoman court were shadows, made flesh, ever present, rarely seen. They were not ghosts, though many treated them as such. They were not invisible, only practiced at being overlooked. The world called them hadum, but even that word was a simplification. They were gatekeepers, guardians, watchers. They opened doors and never entered. They stood beside conversations without ever adding a word. And still, they knew more than most. The empire trusted them because they had been altered. That is the cruel truth. Their bodies, changed young, were thought to make them safe. Safe for the harem, safe for proximity to queens and concubines, safe from ambition. But what the empire failed to see, or perhaps quietly acknowledged, was that silence makes memory stronger. And men who are ignored learn how to listen perfectly. There were two main kinds of court eunuchs, the white and the black. The white eunuchs served in the outer palace. They were often Balkan, often born into Christian families, often educated in the Ottoman way. But it was the black eunuchs, many brought from East Africa, who guarded the inner sanctum, the harem itself. There, they were more than sentinels. They were the breath between secrets. They knew which child was born under which moon, which woman wept behind a screen, which sultan paused before a door but never opened it. They slept in stone rooms with no windows. A gesture perhaps of equal parts security and invisibility. Yet they were not nameless. Some rose to immense power, like Bashir Aga, who lived through 4 sultans and could shape policy with a raised eyebrow. They advised queens. They managed endowments. They influenced royal succession, but always through quiet channels, never open commands. To the empire's chroniclers, eunuchs were footnotes. To the empire's rhythm, they were pulse. Their authority came, not from titles, but from constancy. Ministers came and went, soldiers aged, princes were exiled or crowned, but the eunuchs remained. They remembered who owed favours. They remembered which servant had changed loyalties. They remembered which whispered word, once spoken in trust, could still be used to close a door or shift a fortune. And yet, their own stories were seldom written. No memoirs, no statues, no gilded portraits hung in marble halls. Only shadows cast by the light of other men. But still, they shaped history. When a young prince was hidden for safety, it was a eunuch who carried him through back corridors. When the harem feared poisoning, it was a eunuch who tasted first. When a queen plotted from behind the veil, it was a eunuch who delivered the message, or destroyed it. Their silence was not absence, it was control. Some say the empire designed it this way, that to entrust power to those who could not claim lineage, not marry, not inherit, was safer. But that safety came at a cost. These men lived long lives of servitude, yet they built nothing with their names. No families, no legacies, no burial sites marked with pride. And perhaps that was the point. The Ottomans needed them, but preferred them forgotten. A eunuch could live to see a sultan's birth, reign, and death, and still have no verse sung in his memory. Yet he would know where every secret was stored. He would know which treaties were faked, which alliances were real, and which assassinations were covered by silk and incense. And if ever he were asked, he would smile and bow and say nothing. They didn't need to speak. That was the gift and the curse. Their presence became a form of punctuation, a pause that carried weight, a nod that meant yes or no, or be careful. Now, centuries later, their names are found mostly in ledgers, in imperial records of appointments and duties. Few know their stories, few seek them out. But if you walk the Topkapi Palace in the late hours, when the tour groups have faded and the wind brushes through empty rooms, you might still feel it. That hush, that perfect knowing hush, as if someone is standing just behind you, watching, remembering, not judging, just aware. The eunuchs of the Ottoman court were not just caretakers of the harem, they were caretakers of silence. And in their silence, the empire trusted them with everything it feared to say aloud. Tonight, as we close this chapter, let us offer them a moment of presence. Let us remember the ones who held so much and asked for so little. They did not ask for memory. but they deserve it nonetheless. He held no sword, no shield, no armour glinted on his shoulders, but in his fingers he held the pulse of an empire. The Sultan's physician, a man without power, and yet with the power to undo everything. Not through poison or plot, but through knowledge, through observation, through access no soldier could demand, and no advisor could match. He was not simply a healer, he was a witness. In the Ottoman court, the Hekimbasha, chief physician, lived in quiet proximity to the throne. He was summoned in the dead of night, when fever broke the Sultan's silence. He was present when sons were born, and when mothers slipped into final sleep. He studied the trembling hand that could no longer sign decrees, and the clouding eye that could no longer judge truth from fear. He knew the difference between illness and poison, and sometimes he pretended not to, because in the palace knowledge was a dangerous fever of its own, and a man who knew too much, even in service to the crown, could be unmade just as quickly as a patient with a failing heart. The Sultan's physician had access not only to the royal body, but to its breath, its secrets, its silences. He heard the soft cough that no one else did. He saw the tremor in the Sultan's right hand, masked by ceremony, missed by scribes. He knew when sleep stopped coming and when memory began to fail. But what happens when a ruler is no longer well? And no one is allowed to say so. Some wrote it down, in coded diaries, in scattered notations beside recipes for poultices or prayers. A margin here. His gaze avoids the moonlight. A small mark there, hand cold, eyes lucid, speech uneven. These were not medical records, they were warnings, whispers penned by men who knew they could not speak freely. Others chose silence. They knew too well the stories of those who said too much, and were sent away, or simply disappeared. There is a tale, never fully confirmed, of a physician named Mehmed Effendi, who served a sultan in the late 1600s. He treated a recurring illness, fainting spells it was said, but over time suspected poisoning from within the harem. He confided in no one. Only later, after his sudden death, was a scrap of parchment found hidden behind a tile in his chamber. It bore a single line. She feeds him with her left hand. No names, no date, but it was enough to stir quiet inquiries. Still, most preferred ink to stay inside the well. The physician was, after all, both indispensable and disposable. Revered in recovery, blamed in decline. One misdiagnosis, one fever that would not break, and the hands that once touched the Sultan's brow could be bound behind the back. So they became careful in diagnosis, careful in emotion, careful in truth. Some turned to philosophy, to faith, to the study of the stars, anything to offer the illusion of distance, because to live so close to a throne was to live under its weight. Yet these physicians were not mere bystanders. They shaped the court in ways few understood. They determined when a sultan was too ill to meet foreign envoys, and who would speak in his stead. They advised which herbs calmed not only the stomach, but the temper. They were trusted to know when a prince's madness should be treated, and when it should be concealed. They walked the delicate line between loyalty and survival, and always between silence and duty. The tools they carried were small and simple, vials, herbs, ink-stained notes, thin blades, but none were as sharp as their understanding. They studied in madrasi halls, yes, but also in the corridors of rumour. They learned not only from texts, but from bodies, the way a sultan turned his head when tired, the way his fingers tugged at his robe when in pain. They knew that a monarch's body was not just flesh, but symbol, and that when that symbol cracked, it could never be repaired with medicine alone. There were moments, rare, quiet, usually in winter, when the physician sat beside the sultan, not as a servant, but as a human mirror. When pain stripped away status, when fever peeled away pride, and the healer's touch became not a function, but a comfort. But those moments passed, and the next day he was a servant again, bound by loyalty, bound by risk, bound by the knowledge he could never fully speak. What he saw, he would carry. What he suspected, he would bury. And what he feared, he would write in no book. And now, centuries later, their names are found only in fragments. A medical manuscript attributed vaguely. A marginal note in an imperial diary. A gravestone with no profession listed. But the echoes remain. In the margins of forgotten books, in the cracked tiles of the old infirmary at Topkapi, in the scent of dried mint and rosewater, still faint on the shelves where the vials once stood. He held no sword, but he held the pulse, and sometimes that was more dangerous. Tonight, as you drift into the hush of sleep, remember the healer who could not heal his own burden, the man who knew too much and said just enough to survive. To draw the world is to own it, not with armies or ships but with ink. The Ottomans understood this deeply. Long before satellites and photographs, before borders hardened under international law, the world was shaped by those who could sketch it. A coastline drawn thicker became a territory claimed. A forgotten island remained forgotten. A name written large became a prophecy and a warning. In the grand halls of the palace, beside calligraphers and scholars, lived the quiet masters of perception, the cartographers. They traced not only mountains and rivers, but illusions, deliberate ones. Because maps in the Ottoman Empire were not passive tools. They were instruments of strategy. They guided ships, yes, but they also guided thoughts. At the height of the empire's reach, a golden age stretched from Budapest to Baghdad, from the deserts of Arabia to the shores of the Adriatic. The empire did not just span continents, it interpreted them, and that interpretation could be edited at will. Some maps made islands where there were none. Others shrunk rival lands until they looked harmless. There were ports that never appeared, even after generations of trade. There were lakes so large they swallowed entire provinces, not because they were real, but because they were useful. To understand this, we must begin with one man, Piri Reis, a sailor, scholar, and spy. Piri Reis was also a mapmaker who dared to see the world whole. In 1513, he created a world map, unlike any seen before in the Islamic world. It included parts of the New World. It drew coastlines with haunting precision. And in the margins, it whispered of sources unknown, maps from ancient sailors, maps captured from the Portuguese, maps perhaps older than remembered time. But only part of his world map survives. The rest was lost or hidden. What remains is curved with sea monsters and legends, inscriptions in fine Ottoman Turkish, and a sense of something far larger than permission allowed. It's unclear how many saw it, or how many were meant to. Later, Piri Reis would fall out of favour. Accused of failure during a naval campaign, executed quietly. Another man who knew too much and spoke through ink. But he wasn't the only one to draw the world with both clarity and caution. In Ottoman naval schools, geography was taught with a gentle hand and a selective gaze. Europe was sometimes under-detailed, Africa shaded only along its coasts. The interiors of the Americas, largely blank, sometimes intentionally labelled as lands not worthy of conquest. This wasn't ignorance, it was choice. To omit was to diminish, to mislabel was to defend, to distort was to warn. Maps served many masters, not just geography, but politics, pride and power. A sultan receiving a delegation from Venice might commission a map that portrayed Ottoman holdings more generously than reality. A military leader planning a campaign in the Caucasus might receive a version of a map with tribal regions erased, not to fool the enemy, but to calm the sultan's nerves. And a governor accused of losing a fort might present a newly drawn chart, where the fort had never existed at all. Cartography, in this way, became its own diplomacy. The maps that lied were not lies exactly. They were possibilities, intentions, negotiations drawn in ink. Some were so beautiful, gilded, bordered with floral motifs, brushed in blues and greens, that their accuracy became secondary. They were maps to display, to honour. maps for the walls of viziers, not the hands of sailors. Others were rough, folded and creased, notes scrawled in margins, routes corrected with thumb smudges. These were working maps, maps that breathed with travel and survival. Both kinds could deceive. There's a story, perhaps myth, perhaps true, of an Ottoman cartographer who included a small fictional island in the Aegean on every naval chart for years. No one noticed, until one ship, lost in fog, searched for it. They sailed in circles. The crew believed they had missed it. They waited for a shape that never came, and when they returned, they reported it as real. This is how easily maps can rewrite memory. But the Ottomans weren't alone in this. European maps of the time bore their own fantasies. Cities of gold, inland seas, kingdoms ruled by priests. Yet the Ottoman cartographic tradition held a different tone. Less mythic, more measured, still selective. Sometimes the silences on the page said more than the symbols. A blank space could signal, "We know this land exists, but we choose not to show it." A misdrawn river could say, "We claim this course, even if nature does not." There were also practical reasons to deceive. An empire with enemies on every side, the Habsburgs to the west, the Safavids to the east, pirates to the south, needed to protect its internal geography. Not every fort was marked, not every route was shown. Some maps existed only in memory, passed from father to son, captain to apprentice. And in the end, who were the Ottomans trying to deceive? Sometimes their rivals, sometimes their allies, but often themselves. Because to see the world a certain way, to believe it looked a certain way, was to live with a kind of confidence, a protection. As long as the map remained intact, perhaps the empire did too. Now, centuries later, those maps are studied in quiet rooms. Behind glass, scholars trace the strange coastlines, compare them to modern satellite images, and wonder, was this a mistake or a message? Some islands drawn in Ottoman maps were never found. Others, long dismissed as errors, were eventually confirmed, tiny specks of land lost to shifting seas. Even their lies held fragments of truth. Tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine unrolling an ancient chart on silk, running your hand over an ocean shaped by hope, reading names no longer used, following a river that bends the wrong way. Let your mind sail gently across those imagined shorelines and drift toward the edge of the world as it once was drawn. It shimmered on the hill like a dream you couldn't fully remember. The Topkapi Palace, part fortress, part fantasy, looked down upon the Bosphorus, not as a structure of stone, but as an idea cast in marble and mystery. Its domes caught the morning light like polished shells. Its gardens, layered and fragrant, masked the sharp edges beneath. To the invited guest, the palace appeared generous. Open-air pavilions, grand courtyards, pools that reflected not just sky but power. But it was a place designed to be seen, not known. Because behind the splendor was a deliberate confusion, a kind of architectural misdirection, elegant, subtle, disorienting. The Topkapi was never built to be a single palace. It was grown, courtyard by courtyard, chamber by chamber, ruler by ruler, like a garden left to wander where it pleased. But unlike a garden, its paths were not meant to soothe. They were meant to shift perspective, to delay certainty, to suggest closeness while hiding distance. Some doors led nowhere, others led you back to where you began. Windows opened onto blank walls, corridors ended in gardens that were never marked on any plan. It wasn't just about security, it was about perception. The Sultan was everywhere and nowhere. The power moved silently behind the tiled walls. You could wait hours for an audience and never know how close you truly were. Visitors would marvel, but they would leave no wiser. That was the point. Even the layout told a story meant to be misread. The palace unfolded in a series of courts, 4 main ones, each deeper and more exclusive than the last. You could enter the first court freely, a space for officials, for noise, for the hum of empire. The second court narrowed the path. Bureaucrats, officials, horses stopped here. The third court silenced things. No outsiders beyond this point without permission. It was the realm of the sultan's inner circle. And the fourth, a place of shadows and silence, was not always spoken of at all. Each transition was a filtering, not just of access, but of sound, of sight, of thought. Along the way were mirrored chambers, not glass but reflections of a different kind. Polished marble, glazed tiles, fountains designed to catch and distort light. These surfaces didn't show you yourself. They showed you how the empire wanted to be seen. Glittering, infinite, unreadable. Even sound behaved strangely in Topkapi. In certain courtyards, voices echoed in spirals. You could whisper near one wall and be heard across the garden. And yet, if you shouted, the sound seemed to vanish into the stone. Architects knew this. They crafted it. They used it. A secret told in one corner might travel where you didn't intend. A threat voiced too loudly might reach ears not meant to hear. So servants learned to speak with care, and silence became a form of safety. Missteps happened often, both literal and political. Ambassadors from foreign lands found themselves lost, even with a guide. They mistook a side door for an entrance. They waited in the wrong court for hours, insulted without knowing it. And if they wandered too far, they were politely, but firmly, redirected. No maps of the palace were ever fully accurate. Some showed too little, some too much, and some, it said, were purposefully altered in case they fell into the wrong hands. Even within the empire, not everyone knew the full layout. A cook in the kitchens might spend 30 years without seeing the fourth court. A guard in the harem might hear tales of the council chamber, but never step near it. Each role had its borders, each person their prescribed maze. And yet the palace worked. It functioned like a living being, complex, guarded, layered. Its confusion was its clarity, its beauty, a barrier. For those within the inner circle, the viziers, the scribes, the sultan's attendants, the misdirection became second nature. They moved not just with confidence, but with choreography. They knew which door to open, depending on who was watching, which corridor to use if someone needed to be seen or not seen. There's a small chamber near the third court, quiet, narrow, windowless. No inscription marks its purpose, but some believe it was once a listening room, a place where the sultan's ears, unseen, could hear deliberations before entering. There is no proof, of course, but the room remains. This was the world the palace created, one of half-truths, softened steps, and gentle veils. Even the gardens seemed to obey this language. The flowers were arranged not in rows, but in curves. The walkways did not lead directly to fountains. They arrived diagonally, indirectly. Benches were placed just slightly out of symmetry, enough to unsettle, enough to suggest something just beyond perception. Topkapi was not merely the seat of the empire, it was the empire's mind made marble, a place where everything meant something, and nothing was quite as it seemed. And even today, centuries after the last sultan walked its halls, the palace remains unreadable. Tourists walk the polished stones with cameras and guidebooks, yet still miss the quiet patterns beneath, the changes in tile colour that signal a threshold, the sudden coolness in air that means you've crossed into the oldest part, the room where voices soften for no reason anyone can explain. Some places are meant to be admired, but not understood. Some still aren't. Tonight, let your mind wander that mirrored maze. Step through doors that open into silence. Trace your fingers along tiled walls that remember everything. And if you lose your way, smile. You were never meant to know the whole path, only the echoes. A language can be a bridge, but it can also be a wall. In the Ottoman Empire, words had architecture. Some built doors, others built ceilings you could never reach. Ottoman Turkish, the language of law, poetry, record and ritual, was not the language of the people. It was a language wrapped in layers, like the empire itself. elegant, distant, fortified. Laced with Persian beauty and Arabic gravity, Ottoman Turkish flowed like calligraphy down the pages of court documents and divan poetry. Its words carried weight, but that weight pressed differently on different backs. For the palace, it was precision. For the street, it was exclusion. The people, the farmers, traders, cooks, weavers, spoke in a lighter tongue, a form of Turkish closer to its Central Asian roots, trimmed of flourishes, built for breath, not ceremony. They could speak to one another, but they could not read what ruled them. Edicts came down from high marble halls in a script many could not decipher. Laws were announced by men who read from scrolls written in a voice the villagers never heard at home. Even religious sermons echoed in Arabic, while daily prayer was whispered in a tongue more familiar, softer, local, stripped of imperial sheen. And so, words became borders, not between nations, but between castes of understanding. To learn Ottoman Turkish was not merely to learn vocabulary, it was to learn status. It meant access to education, to record keeping, to administration. To know it was to belong, or at least to be admitted into the halls where belonging was negotiated. The empire did not formally forbid the lower classes from learning the script. It simply made it difficult. Schools were limited, books were expensive. Most learning was done in mosques, if at all, and the script itself, the Arabic script adapted for Turkish, was complex, flowing, difficult to master. A single sentence could contain 3 languages: Turkish syntax, Persian metaphors, Arabic theology. A single mistake could shift the meaning. A misplaced vowel could turn blessing into burden. This was not accidental. A complicated language maintains a complicated power, and the court preferred it that way. It allowed the sultan's scribes to write verdicts no peasant could protest. It allowed land records to be kept in a vocabulary that could never be casually questioned. It allowed treaties to be made, taxes to be levied, decisions to be etched in ink, beyond the eyes of those most affected by them. This distance, between the written and the spoken, between the ruled and the ruler, was vast, but in the cracks of that distance, something else took root. Stories, folk tales and songs became the libraries of the people. They sang what they could not read. They passed down truths through rhythm, not script. A mother would not quote a legal decree, but she might sing of a king who lost his crown because he forgot his people's tongue. A farmer might not recite court records, but he might know a parable of a judge who couldn't understand the woman he sentenced. These were not just stories. They were soft rebellions, spoken literacy. In time, some tried to bridge the gap. Poets began writing in the vernacular, simpler Turkish, closer to the heart. Reformers pushed for language education across classes. Some scribes in secret translated edicts for village imams, not to disobey, but to be understood. And yet the official language held firm. It was beautiful. It was sacred. It was untouchable. Even today, scholars struggle with its texts. So much is buried not just in the content, but in the style. Phrases so ornate they obscure their meaning. Sentences that dance for pages before saying yes or no. But beauty too can be a disguise. And when the empire fell, slowly, painfully, beneath its own weight, one of the first revolutions was in words. In 1928, under Ataturk, the Turkish language was reformed. The Arabic script was replaced with Latin letters. The vocabulary was simplified. The state spoke plainly, for the first time. But with that shift came loss. Thousands of texts, centuries of poetry, records, journals, became unreadable overnight to the modern public. The bridge had been rebuilt, but the old garden on the other side grew quiet. Still, in the cracks, the meaning lingers. An old manuscript found in a village chest. A tile inscribed with a verse whose meaning no one knows, but everyone feels. A lullaby with Persian meter and Turkish soul. A story whose origin is forgotten, but whose rhythm lives on. The language that wasn't taught wasn't erased. It simply became quieter. And tonight, as your breath slows, Listen for it, that forgotten voice carried in old stone, faded ink, a whisper in a borrowed tongue, a language not spoken aloud, but still waiting to be understood. They were painted in whispers, described by travellers as veiled ornaments, ghost-like figures behind gilded screens. The women of the Ottoman harem, often imagined, seldom understood. But inside those walls, past the silence and the incense, lived minds sharper than the blades at the janissaries' sides. Not all resistance is loud, some is sown. The imperial harem was not a cage, though it often felt like one. It was a world within a world, layered, hierarchical, ritualized. From the lowliest servant to the valide sultan, the sultan's mother, power flowed in silken currents. And where speech was limited, creativity expanded. In silk, in thread, in gesture, they embroidered their thoughts, wove secrets into carpets, painted truths in miniature, not because they were forbidden to speak to Biam, but because no one outside was listening. The women learned early that fabric was memory. A stitch held meaning. A motif could whisper what lips could not. Take the tulip, a favourite in Ottoman art. To the court it symbolised elegance, refinement, paradise, but to the women of the harem it could say other things. Longing, separation. One petal turned slightly sideways in a border design might signal grief. A tulip without leaves, abandonment, placed near a rose, forbidden affection. These were not accidents. A woman might be forbidden to write letters to her family, but she could send them a handkerchief with a stitch of red thread where none should be, and they would understand. A rug sent from the harem to a distant relative might carry a pattern not listed in any artisan's guide. A broken symmetry, a mirrored knot. It was a letter made of wool. It was the voice of a woman who hadn't been seen in years. Even the garments worn by the women themselves spoke. Robes lined in verses from poems. Undersleeves embroidered with tiny names. Sashes that looked like vines but traced a hidden sentence. One woman, a concubine known only in records as Aishi, was said to stitch a tiny thread of silver into every hem she wore. A symbol of the moon, her name's meaning, and a promise to herself. To remain whole, even in pieces. We do not know her story in full, but her garments remain, preserved in a palace drawer, too delicate to touch. The silver still glints when caught by candlelight. The valide sultan, mother to the reigning sultan, wielded immense power, and many knew it, but even she stitched. Some say she embroidered prayers into her bedding. Others say she laced warnings into the cuffs of her son's robes. True or not, the idea remains. Even the most powerful women used thread as testimony. Why? Because paper could be burned. Because ink-stained fingers raised suspicion. Because language, written, was monitored, but pattern was free. These women were not merely seamstresses of habit. They were historians, chroniclers of emotion, archivists of injustice. Some rugs now preserved in museums hold what appear to be deliberate imperfections. A single wrong colour bead, a misaligned knot, a reversed border. Textile scholars call them mistakes with intent. We call them messages. We do not always know what they said, but we know they meant something. And meaning, hidden long enough, becomes survival. Some women had access to tutors, especially the Sultan's favoured consorts and daughters. They learned Persian poetry, read stories from Arab philosophers, wrote their own verses. But those pages rarely left the palace. What did leave were gifts, garments, cushions, tapestries, sent to foreign courts or distant provinces. And in those threads, their authors travelled with them. Imagine, a French ambassador's wife receives a velvet pouch stitched with a rose beside a serpent. She admires the beauty. She wears it to a gathering. She never knows the rose was meant to signal love denied. She never sees that the serpent is curved like a question mark. But the woman who made it knew, and that knowing, that silent authorship, was enough. Some forms of expression defy translation. In the harem, music was played, stories were told, Gestures carried meaning. The way a cup of coffee was presented, how a veil was worn that day, the colour of a sash. But textiles, those lived longest. Because thread does not forget. Because silk outlasts the body. Even centuries later, we can trace the fingertips of a girl who lived her entire life behind screens, but whose thoughts dance in gold along the hem of a child's blanket. The empire may have intended to keep its women hidden, but their artistry betrayed that aim. They were not voiceless. They simply used a different alphabet, one made of colour, of form, of careful pause. Tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine a dimly lit room, warmed by coals, filled with the quiet rhythm of needles pulling thread. A group of women, laughing softly, speaking in glances, and stitching more than patterns. Stitching memory, stitching themselves. Their words were not spoken, but they lived. And they live still, in every thread that catches the light, and every silence that feels like a song. Not all losses are loud. Some disappearances happen quietly, without fire, without theft, without a single cry of alarm. A book goes missing. A scroll is no longer copied. A page is torn, then forgotten. And somewhere behind a closed door, someone chooses not to look for it. In the long shadow of the Ottoman Empire's golden age, where scholars once filled the halls with their questions, and sultans sponsored the building of observatories, certain texts, brilliant, delicate, ahead of their time, simply vanished. They were not myths, they were real. They were written, copied, shelved, referenced, and then not. A treatise on celestial movement, said to surpass Ptolemy in complexity, known only through a citation in a later work. A manuscript describing a rotating steam mechanism, centuries before Europe's industrial engines. A set of alchemical recipes detailing not just transformation of metals, but controlled chemical reactions, including pressure regulation. They were seen, and then they weren't. Some say these works were gifted, traded in diplomacy, sent to foreign courts as offerings, not unlike diamonds or spices. In this version of the story, the empire was generous. The manuscripts travelled to Venice, to Paris, to London, where scholars quietly translated them, integrated them, and never spoke of where the ideas began. Others say they were burned, not in hatred, but in fear. Too radical, too foreign, too full of ideas that could disrupt the careful balance of belief and power. A text that questioned the Earth's central place in the universe. A diagram that implied perpetual motion. A formula that replaced divine intervention with mathematics. In this telling, a decree was issued, a chamber was cleared, and flame replaced footnotes. The truth may be neither, or both, because within the palace the act of erasure was not always destruction. Sometimes it was storage. A manuscript declared too dangerous for circulation might not be burned, just hidden. Removed from catalogues, placed in unlabelled drawers, moved to private collections and forgotten by all but one careful hand. The empire, after all, knew how to preserve what it could not control. In the late 17th century, a traveller named Selim Effendi wrote of visiting a room in the imperial library where the stars are forbidden. He described seeing manuscripts locked behind a lattice, unlisted in any index. He was told they belonged to a previous sultan who had an unhealthy love of machines and moons. Selim's account was never verified, but his journal was copied by hand and survives. Sometimes, even the copies of what vanished became ghosts themselves. A scholar might reference a diagram in a footnote, but when later generations searched for it, they found only blank pages or annotations scribbled in ink so faded, the meaning dissolved. And yet, the mention remained. A haunting shape. See the device on page 42, but there is no page 42. There is only silence. What makes these disappearances feel stranger still is the timing. Many of the vanished works date from the 1500s to the 1700s, a period when the empire was still rich. With curiosity, Astronomers like Taqi al-Din built observatories rivaling anything in Europe. Inventors drew diagrams of mechanical clocks, geared fountains, automated music machines. There was a hunger then, not just for knowledge, but for possibility. And then, a turn. The great observatory in Istanbul was destroyed in 1580, struck not by war, but by decree. The reason? Officially, divine disapproval. But perhaps it was fear of what might be discovered, of what could no longer be controlled. Some say the manuscripts were buried with the ruins, others say they were carried away by scholars fleeing censorship. A few believe they were hidden in mosques, disguised among theological texts, an old trick of preservation. There is even a legend, never confirmed, of a manuscript sealed into the dome of a mosque, written in invisible ink, readable only by moonlight. But perhaps the most painful losses happened slowly, through neglect, a leaking roof, a rodent's teeth, a page used to wrap herbs in a village bazaar. Knowledge, when unguarded, vanishes without flame. And yet, the whispers persist. In recent decades, fragments have surfaced, a half-burned folio discovered inside the spine of a later book, a water-stained page listing weights and balances for an unknown device, a miniature painting depicting a wheel that spins but has no source of power. Each find is incomplete, each raises more questions, but together they suggest something haunting, that the empire knew more than we think, that it dreamed more than it dared declare, and that somewhere, in an attic, in a drawer, beneath a cracked tile, the rest may still wait. Not all vanished things are lost. Some are only waiting for quiet eyes and a gentle touch. So tonight, imagine turning the pages of a book no one has seen in centuries. Imagine the scent of old ink and cedar, a diagram drawn in steady hand, a sentence that ends with a question never answered. Let yourself drift with those missing words. Let your thoughts follow the soft trail of what might have been. Because not all truths are in the books we read. Some sleep inside the ones we no longer know how to find. Above the domes of Istanbul, the stars blinked softly, distant, ancient, patient. They had always been watched, but one day they were studied too closely. And in that closeness, fear took root. For centuries, the Ottomans charted the heavens with reverence. Astronomy was not forbidden. It was sacred, used to mark prayer times, to align the foundations of mosques, to honour the lunar calendar that guided the rhythm of faith. But between reverence and curiosity, there is a narrow ledge, and one man stepped beyond it. His name was Taqi al-Din, a scholar of numbers, a master of instruments. In the 1570s, with the blessing of Sultan Murad III, he built an observatory on a hill in Istanbul, rising high above the waters of the Bosphorus. It was unlike anything the empire had ever seen. A round tower filled with astrolabes, sextants, and celestial globes, not just to observe, but to calculate. Not just to admire the heavens, but to understand them. Taqi al-Din believed the universe had rhythm, and that rhythm could be measured. He recorded planetary movements with precision. He built mechanical clocks for timing the stars. He wrote tables that challenged the great Ptolemy himself. For a time, the empire allowed it. A new era, they said, a golden age for science. But gold turns quickly when light is cast from the wrong angle. Taqi al-Din's observatory stood for only a few short years, and then, with barely a warning, it was destroyed. By cannon. Not by war, but by decree. In 1580, under pressure from religious authorities, Sultan Murad ordered the observatory razed to the ground. The tower crumbled, the instruments shattered. The stars, it seemed, were not to be questioned after all. Why? Not because the sky was forbidden, but because what might be found in it was feared. There were whispers that Taqi al-Din had predicted an eclipse too precisely, that he spoke of comets, not as omens, but as orbits, that his measurements placed Earth too far from the centre, and God too far from Earth. Some said he had gone too far into European thought. Others said he simply asked the wrong questions at the wrong time. But perhaps the deeper truth is quieter still. The empire did not fear the stars. It feared what the stars might undo, for in the sky there is no sultan. No court, no hierarchy, only motion, only pattern, only laws not written by men. To study the heavens was to admit a deeper design, one the empire could not control. And so the telescope was turned to ash. The pages of Taqi al-Din's books were not burned, but they were shelved, set aside, quieted, and with them a path closed. Europe built onward. Galileo, Kepler, Newton. Their questions shook kingdoms, their telescopes opened galaxies. But in Istanbul, the sky went silent. The empire returned to tables from centuries past, to orbits measured by memory, not experiment, to a view of the universe that kept man at the centre, unmoved. But not all knowledge burned so easily. Fragments of Taqi al-Din's work survived, hidden in manuscripts, copied in secret. His diagrams of lunar movement, his writings on mechanical time, his proposal for a steam-driven water pump, a precursor to machines that would later define modernity. And in the quiet corners of libraries, his name was whispered again. Some called him a genius, others a warning. But the star, they remembered. They continued their slow, perfect dance, unaffected by fear or fire or forgotten towers. And now, if you walk the hills where the observatory once stood, you will not find stone, but perhaps on a clear night, you will feel the echo of a man who dared to ask the sky a question, and waited, pencil in hand, heart in balance, for the universe to answer. Tonight, as you rest beneath your own quiet heavens, imagine that tower, filled with instruments that tick and hum, scrolls unrolled, eyes lifted, and one man standing alone, not seeking control, only understanding. Because even in silence, the sky continues to speak, and someone somewhere will always listen. Ink dries softly, but once it has settled, it becomes difficult to forget. In the Ottoman Empire, where parchment curled gently beneath candlelight, and the scratch of a reed pen marked the rhythm of scholarship, words were power, and therefore dangerous. Scribes copied not only poetry and law, but policy, doctrine, and decree. They were artisans of accuracy, sworn to replicate, not to question. Their pens were supposed to obey, but not all ink followed orders. Some scribes, hidden in scriptoria deep within libraries or palace chambers, slipped truths between the lines. Not grand declarations, not manifestos, just fragments. A line added in a margin, a symbol shifted slightly, a poem concealed in the architecture of the page. They knew the rules, but they also knew the silence, and how heavy it became when too long unbroken. So they wrote what they could not say, in the space between columns, in the curvature of a letter, in the choice of a word whose meaning whispered something else to those who knew how to listen. We call them annotations. The empire called them accidents, when it noticed at all. But they were not mistakes, they were messages. A court scribe might copy an official edict, bold, unforgiving, final. But in the margin he might add a single verse of Sufi poetry. The road that bends also leads home. Was it a comment on the ruling? Was it grief for what the law erased? Was it simply memory? The line remains. Others were more precise. Mathematicians forced to teach accepted theories would quietly note alternate equations in the margins of textbooks, early inklings of parabolic motion, alternative systems of timekeeping, hints that they saw the stars differently than the state allowed. Some were eventually discovered. Their texts were confiscated, their writings blackened or scratched out. But erasure is never perfect. Ink leaves a ghost, parchment remembers pressure, and in the right light, angled and soft, even a scraped word rises again. There are stories of certain books passing from hand to hand, not because of what they said, but because of what they nearly said. A volume of legal commentary passed between judges, known to contain a single hidden sentence. When the law forgets the heart remembers the law. No one quoted it, but everyone read it, and in some small way, it shaped how they ruled. There were also women scribes, fewer, less documented, but present. Inside the harem's quieter chambers, educated consorts sometimes copied religious texts or poetry. They too added small touches. An extra flourish, a name hidden in pattern, a verse changed just slightly to mean something. Only they would understand. One such copy of a Quran, now preserved in a museum, contains a decorative border in which the word sabr, patience, appears more times than required. A mistake or a plea, the empire attempted to regulate all writing. Certain topics were forbidden, certain books were monitored, copyists were expected to submit work for inspection. But oversight has limits, especially when the rebellion is as small as a letter. And over time the ink survived. Some texts resurfaced centuries later, in private libraries' dusty archives, beneath the covers of innocuous books. A treatise on waterworks, hiding a meditation on power. A medical guide with a tucked-in note about poisons used in royal kitchens. A poem once banned, written out by hand and hidden inside a hollowed Quran. These were not accidents of preservation, they were acts of quiet courage. Because to write something down is to believe it might matter. Not now, perhaps, but someday. The scribes knew they would not be remembered. Their names are rarely known, their ink often attributed to others. But they wrote anyway. Because history is not only the stories we are told, it is the footnotes someone fought to keep. And so, the empire that sought to control knowledge became unknowingly a vessel for dissent. Its libraries held secrets it never meant to keep. Its schools trained hands that would later rebel, not with weapons but with pages. Its belief in the permanence of paper became its greatest vulnerability. For paper lives, it breathes when touched, it cracks when folded, it remembers. Even now, in museum basements and university vaults, archivists uncover annotations that shift the meaning of entire manuscripts. A margin turns a celebration into a question. A tiny drawing shifts praise into parody. These moments remind us, truth does not always shout. Sometimes it waits, small and steady, on the edge of the page. Tonight, as you rest, picture a single candle flickering beside an open manuscript. A scribe leans in, heart pounding just slightly, as he adds one more line. Not to be noticed, not to be praised, but simply to exist. Because he knew, even then, ink cannot be erased, not truly. It only waits for someone to read it, slowly, gently, with care. Empires expand in ink and blood, but they are tested in silence. Beyond Istanbul's gleaming palaces and echoing courts, beyond the minarets that pierced the imperial sky, stretched a land that did not always kneel. Syria, Arabia, the Hejaz, the deserts where wind carved dunes more faithfully than sultans carved loyalty. Out in the provinces, the Ottoman grip loosened, not because it was weak, but because the land itself resisted control. The desert does not shout, it holds its breath, and so did the people. The Ottomans ruled from afar, a governor dispatched, taxes collected, troops rotated, decrees issued in Turkish, translated by scribes into Arabic, then mumbled into meaning by village elders. The words arrived, but sometimes obedience did not. Not all rebellion looks like fire. Sometimes it looks like leaving. A tribe quietly shifts its tents deeper into the dunes, beyond the taxman's reach. A caravan reroutes through an older, unpatrolled path. A preacher offers a sermon with different emphasis, the kind that doesn't mention the sultan. There were no battle drums, just choices made in silence, and the empire often let it be. For centuries, the Ottoman approach to rule in these borderlands was more atmospheric than absolute. They knew the sand was too wide, the tribes too many, the water too scarce to chase every disobedience. So they watched, waited, bargained. In cities like Aleppo and Damascus, the Ottoman presence was stronger. Governors set up court. Taxes were more consistent. The call to prayer aligned with the empire's rhythm. But even here, the loyalty was often practical, not passionate. Behind closed doors in old stone homes, elders remembered the time before the Ottomans. And sometimes, in the courtyards, stories were told of a time after them. It wasn't hatred, it was distance. The empire spoke in Turkish. The people thought in Arabic. The empire ruled from marble. The people lived in dust and date palms. This was not a cultural war. It was a quiet misalignment. And in that gap, resistance settled. Not in weapons, but in waiting. There were revolts, of course. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Bedouin tribes raided Ottoman caravans. There were uprisings in the Hijaz, in the Nejd, in the hills above Jerusalem. Some were crushed, some were bargained with, some were ignored, not because they didn't matter, but because the empire knew a lesson. Sometimes chasing noise only makes it louder. So they learned to measure silence, to interpret absence, to read between the dates on the tax ledger. When a village failed to report its census, was it oversight or a message? When a well went dry near a garrison, was it nature or sabotage? When a prayer leader stopped including the Sultan's name in Friday sermons, was it forgetfulness or defiance? The desert offered few answers, but many clues. In Arabia, the Ottomans walked a particularly careful line. They controlled the holy cities, Mecca and Medina, a stewardship both sacred and strategic. It gave them religious legitimacy, but it also came with tension. Local sharifs, guardians of the holy cities, often operated like semi-independent rulers. They negotiated, threatened, delayed. The empire sent gifts, troops, gold, but it never fully owned the sand it stepped on. The further east one travelled, the more delicate things became. By the 18th century, movements began to stir, not loud, not yet. Preachers calling for a return to older ways, communities isolating themselves from Ottoman oversight, small pockets of fundamentalism, winds picking up. But still, the desert held its breath. Even the pilgrims, tens of thousands travelling yearly across desert routes to Mecca, carried more than prayers. They carried stories of discontent, of rumours, of villages where the empire's laws were folded neatly and set aside like an unused robe. And yet, the Ottomans endured. Because for every silent rebellion, there was also silent agreement. There were tribes who protected caravans, cities that welcomed imperial funding, families that sent sons to serve in the Ottoman army, not for love, but for bread. This was the empire's quiet compromise. Let them whisper, let them drift, so long as they do not burn. But silence, like sand, shifts over time. By the 19th century, cracks widened. Global powers, Britain, France, peered into the desert. Missionaries, agents, maps. The Ottoman silence began to break, not from within, but from the sound of other empires breathing at the edges. And in response, the old hush became more urgent. The Ottomans tried to centralize. More governors, more soldiers, new railroads through Arabia, new laws in old cities. But the desert does not rush, it remembers, and in its memory, the empire was always slightly out of step. Today, the ruins remain. Fortresses half buried in sand, old caravanserais worn by wind, crumbling stone markers of an empire that once tried to listen, but not always closely enough. Yet some things never disappeared. A prayer still whispered in both Arabic and Turkish, a tribal song that mentions a vanished tax collector, a door in a village home painted the deep green of Ottoman banners. The silence still lingers, but now it is memory, not rebellion. Tonight, as the wind softens outside your window, imagine the desert at dusk. A group of travellers sit by a fire, no one speaks. But in that stillness is a choice, to stay, to leave, to obey, to wait. Because the desert does not need to shout, it speaks best when holding its breath. Not all promises are made to be kept. Some are written, signed, sealed with solemnity, and then hidden, folded deep, locked away in wood and dust. A document becomes a gesture becomes a strategy, and a signature becomes a silence. In the heart of the Ottoman archives, there was once a box, unmarked, unremarkable, and unopened for decades. Inside it lay a treaty, signed between the empire and a provincial leader. Its ink had not even dried before it was forgotten, or rather, made to be forgotten. The document was real. Its terms were specific: land rights, trade access, safe passage, a promise of protection in exchange for allegiance. And yet, from the moment the final ribbon was tied around its parchment, the treaty began to disappear. Not burned, not denounced, but boxed. No public announcement, no follow-up letters, no implementation, just silence. The region in question, a sensitive borderland nestled between ambition and unrest, had long been a bruise for the empire. Too distant to govern easily, too visible to ignore. Its leaders had grown weary of imperial delay, yet feared direct confrontation. And so, after months of delicate back-channeling, the two sides sat together in a candlelit room. They spoke in softened voices, they drank bitter coffee, and they signed. Historians debate what happened next. Some say a change in leadership came swiftly in the capital. A new vizier who viewed the treaty as a mistake, a weakness. Others believed the Sultan never approved the agreement and let it die quietly rather than rescind it outright. But most agree. The treaty was not destroyed. It was simply buried, sealed in a lacquered wooden box, filed beneath vague labelling, and never spoken of again. The provincial leader, betrayed but unwilling to risk war, remained silent. He ruled as before, but with a colder heart. Trade slowed, letters stopped, and slowly, over the years, the region slipped further from the empire's grasp. It was not an uprising, it was a withdrawal, and perhaps that was more dangerous. Because silence creates a space no treaty can fill, and what's buried once can be buried again. The empire would go on to sign other treaties, some honoured, some not, but this one remained uniquely invisible. A document that proved a promise was made, and then unmade without word. It sat in that wooden box for years, decades, untouched, unread. Time softened its ink, humidity curled its edges, but the words remained. One day, a young archivist cataloguing old cases stumbled upon it. The seal was intact, the signature clear, the language firm, unmistakable in its intent. He brought it to his superior. The superior skimmed the page, and then quietly slid it back into the box. Not now, not necessary, not wise, and so it returned to the shadows. Because some agreements do not die by fire, they die by silence, by careful forgetting. Yet the people remembered. Stories passed down in villages told of a time the empire promised protection and offered none. Old men recalled a messenger who arrived with velvet robes and gold ink, then vanished into the hills. Traders spoke of roads that were supposed to open but never did. These stories changed in the telling, but they kept the shape of betrayal. Even now, the treaty is rarely mentioned in scholarly texts. It exists in footnotes, in offhand references, in the quiet knowledge that not every empire's word is meant to echo. And yet, the treaty remains, still tucked away in some archive, a piece of paper that once held power and now holds a question. What if it had been honoured? Would a region have prospered? Would an alliance have held? Would a different history have been written? Or would it still have ended the same, not with war, but with a door closed softly and a box left unopened? Tonight, as you rest, imagine that moment. A candle flickering over parchment, two hands reaching for the same pen, a name written slowly, a seal pressed with finality, and then the sound of wood, closing over paper, a box placed on a shelf, a promise tucked away, not broken, not kept, only forgotten. Because some of history's loudest truths were never spoken aloud. They were placed in boxes and left for the dust to decide. There were songs once, played in the back streets of Istanbul, whistled softly by sailors on dark waters, sung behind closed shutters, where the light from oil lamps trembled on stone. Songs not written down, not taught, only passed from mouth to mouth, like secrets wrapped in sound. And then one day, they weren't. Not because the melodies were forgotten, but because someone decided they should be. The Ottoman Empire, rich in musical tradition, had long embraced rhythm and tone. Court musicians played with precision in vast echoing chambers. Sufi dervishes spun to the slow heartbeat of divine instruments. Military bands thundered into battle with drums and horns that could shake a city's breath. But outside the palace, another music lived, rougher, more human, full of laughter, sorrow, mischief, and truth. Songs that named things too clearly, that spoke of hunger when officials claimed there was none, that remembered a prince fallen from favour, that rhymed the name of a vizier with a curse. Folk music. It had many shapes: türkü, mani, art, songs of the field, of grief, of love lost in the rain. But there was one strain the empire feared most, the satirical ballad. A tune sung in a marketplace, mocking a new tax. A chorus shouted in a tavern after too much wine, blaming the sultan's advisors for a failed harvest. A lullaby, altered just slightly, to suggest a different kind of justice. Melodies that moved too quickly, words that travelled without paper, verses that couldn't be traced to any single author. These were not performances, they were resistance. And so, over time, certain songs were outlawed, not all at once, not always publicly, but gradually, like the dimming of a lantern. A tavern keeper fined for allowing musicians to gather after dark. A sailor arrested for singing a verse about a corrupt judge. A music manuscript confiscated from a street performer, never seen again. The empire did not silence all music, but it began to prefer certain kinds. Court-sanctioned compositions, tunes in approved meters, played with refined instruments, music that praised, not questioned. Official music schools emerged, where students were taught the makams, the strict musical modes of Ottoman tradition. There was beauty there, undeniable beauty, but beyond those schools, in kitchens, courtyards, and ports, the other songs remained. They were not written, they were not recorded, they were remembered. And memory became their rebellion. A grandmother stirring lentils might hum a melody her own mother taught her, one that ended with a line about a vizier who tripped on his own lies. Children would giggle, not knowing the story behind it, but they remembered the tune. In some fishing towns, older men swore they still knew the rhythm of a song banned 3 generations ago, though no one dared sing it aloud. Not fully, not in one sitting. And in the hills, shepherds sang to their flocks in a language long discouraged, mixing Turkish, Kurdish, Armenian, weaving sorrow into the wind. Some say music never disappears, it only changes shape. In the 19th century, as imperial control tightened in certain provinces, songs shifted again. They became more cryptic. Stories of lost love doubled as stories of lost freedom. A song about a broken boat was really about a broken treaty. A lament for a dead bird mourned a poet who'd vanished. The empire couldn't ban everything, so it banned the obvious. In 1876, during a period of attempted reform and political paranoia, rumours swirled of a blacklist, songs that were not to be sung, names that were not to be mentioned. There's no surviving copy of that list, but the fear of it shaped what people sang for years. Still, the tunes found a way. A melody hummed beneath one's breath, a whistle on the way to market, a rhythm tapped out on a wooden spoon, and perhaps the most defiant of all, the silence between verses, the pauses where a forbidden line should be, the hush that says, "We remember," even if we don't say it. Later, as the empire weakened and fractured, as wars broke its borders and time pulled its sultans from thrones, many of these outlawed songs re-emerged. Scholars began collecting folk music in the early 20th century. They found verses no one had claimed, tunes with no known origin, and in the spaces between notes, they found something else. Truth. Not official truth, not history book truth, but the truth people carry in rhythm, in rhyme, in repetition. Some melodies were traced back to moments the empire had erased. A tax revolt, a massacre, a treaty signed then buried, and yet the music remembered. It remembered what the records had censored. It remembered what the scribes had been forbidden to write. Because a song once sung does not vanish. It travels, through mouths, across mountains, inside breath. Even now you might hear fragments. A child singing to herself on a dirt road in eastern Anatolia. A cafe musician playing a tune that doesn't match his written sheet. An old woman humming as she kneads dough. Her eyes half closed, her voice from somewhere far older than memory. You may not know the meaning. She may not say it, but the music carries it still. Tonight, as you lie in the quiet, listen gently. To the wind against the glass, to the hush between sounds, to the heartbeat of a song once forbidden, now free. Because some truths are too soft to be shouted, they are meant to be hummed. In a quiet corner of Istanbul, past the spires and domes, beyond the footpaths worn thin by time, there is a vault, not hidden, not forgotten, just sealed. The stone around it is old, but not crumbling. The door is reinforced, the lock changed more than once. There are no guards, but there is always someone nearby. It is called by many names: the closed archive, the red room, the cabinet without a key. No one speaks of it loudly, but everyone who studies the empire knows it is there. Inside, it is said, are documents untouched in decades, parchments, letters, reports, maps, some from the final days of the empire, some older still. No fire destroyed them, no water spoiled them. They exist intact, indexed, categorized, and yet unopened. Scholars apply for access. They submit requests with quiet hope and careful phrasing. Sometimes they receive a reply, under review, not currently available. The collection is being preserved, but preservation, like silence, can stretch for years. What lies behind that door? Some believe it holds political secrets, treaties made in desperation, alliances betrayed, plans once drafted and never acted upon. Others whisper of darker things, confessions, censored testimonies, records of purges never acknowledged. And still others think the vault contains the stories no empire wants to tell. The failures, the regrets, the words written in the empire's final breaths. It is not unusual for archives to close, for restoration, security, or transition. But this closure lingers, quietly, deliberately. There is no scandal to point to, no official reason, just delay. 1 year becomes 2. A decade passes, a generation of historians waits. Some retire, some stop asking, some begin to doubt the archive was ever open at all. But it was. Old scholars speak of it with reverence. They remember reading fragments, a letter from a governor warning of unrest he was ordered not to mention, a report from a foreign envoy, never published, sealed in imperial script, minutes from a secret council, redacted before it could be copied. Nothing definitive, but enough to make the mind stir. And then the door was closed, not slammed, not locked in ceremony, just no longer opened. Perhaps it was fear, or grief, or something quieter still. The knowledge that once certain truths are seen, they cannot be unseen. Because the final years of the Ottoman Empire were not clean. They were years of war and exile, of shifting loyalties and sharpened silences, of policies written in haste and regrets, sealed beneath ink. What if the archive contains not answers, but questions? Not a single, explosive revelation, but 1,000 small fractures. enough to shift the narrative, enough to whisper that history is softer than we thought. And perhaps that is the reason for the resistance, not conspiracy, not malice, just the deep, aching weight of what still rests inside. To open the archive is to listen again, to men who begged not to carry out their orders, to women who wrote from behind the veil of empire, to provinces that cried softly into the folds of unfiled reports. And once we listen, we must answer. For now, the vault stays quiet, its shelves undisturbed, its keys held in offices with no windows. Sometimes late at night, the archivists say the hallway near the vault is cooler than the rest, as if the past, untouched, is still breathing behind the stone. But no one enters, not yet, because some truths are not dangerous. They are just too heavy, too dense with sorrow, too layered with contradiction, too tangled in what might have been. And so the vault waits, not in darkness, but in pause, a library asleep, dreaming of hands that might one day be ready to turn its pages. Tonight, as the city sleeps above its secrets, imagine that sealed room, the smell of parchment, the silence between shelves, the presence of words that want to be read, but not too soon. Perhaps history isn't always ready to be remembered, and perhaps memory itself has a patience deeper than time. A letter can change a life, or end one. It can summon an army, start a war, save a brother, declare a love, but only if it arrives. And in the vast sprawl of the Ottoman Empire, with its palaces, deserts, islands, and shifting borders, not every letter reached the hands for which it was meant. Some were lost, some were delayed, and some were stopped on purpose, because silence too can be a message. And in this empire, silence often travelled faster than ink. The Ottoman postal system, known as the Ulak courier network, was once a marvel, a relay of riders and stations crisscrossing the empire's wide territories from the Balkans to Baghdad. Dispatches galloped across mountains, edicts arrived with seals unbroken, information moved, but not always freely. There were layers to the system. Letters marked with the sultan's tukra travelled first. Military orders took precedence. Then came administrative correspondence. And beneath all that, personal messages, letters of merchants, of lovers, of dissenters. And sometimes, those lower letters never moved at all. A courier might be stopped at a checkpoint. A letter opened, read, copied, then either passed forward or quietly set aside. If it was deemed too sensitive, too critical, too emotional, too curious, it might be held indefinitely. No announcement, no explanation, just absence. And in that absence lives unravelled. A son waited for news of his father's pardon. The pardon was written, signed. But the letter never left the city. The son rebelled. He thought he had been betrayed. He hadn't. He had simply never received the truth. Elsewhere, a border town waited for confirmation of reinforcements. The letter had been sent, but was intercepted by a rival within the court, a man who knew that delay meant weakness. By the time the town received word, it was already surrounded, and the empire lost a gate it had held for generations. This was not always sabotage. Sometimes it was bureaucracy, a message lost beneath others, a courier who grew ill, a scribe who forgot. But sometimes, all deliberate, because to stop a letter is to stop a moment, to change time, to rewrite the sequence of cause and effect. The empire understood this. In the later centuries, particularly as unrest grew in the provinces, the censorship of letters became more formal. A bureau was created, the Kalemi Masusa. Officially, it was meant to manage sensitive communications. Unofficially, it watched for words that wandered too far. Phrases like, "We are tired of waiting." "The tax is not just, why must we bow forever?" These were not threats, but they were enough. A letter with such a phrase might be returned to the capital, or copied and forwarded to someone else entirely. A governor, a spy, a minister with an interest. And the original, perhaps delivered weeks late, perhaps never at all. One archive in the capital holds a bundle of intercepted letters from a port city in the 1800s, all from the same man, writing to his brother, describing the rise of discontent among local soldiers. The letters were never sent, but they were kept, read, underlined. The brother never replied, because he never knew. The man who wrote them eventually vanished. We remember the empire as a structure of domes and swords, but it was also built on envelopes never opened. There were love letters too. A young woman in Damascus wrote to a court musician in Edirne. She had heard his composition played in the mosque and said it made her heart still. She sent him a poem, but the letter passed through a censor. Its tone was deemed improper. The letter was discarded. She waited, and when no reply came, she assumed he had laughed. He never knew she existed. How many stories died this way? Not with violence, not with fire, but with a letter that paused too long in a drawer. Still, people found ways. Merchants used codes. They wrote about spices when they meant soldiers, about weather when they meant unrest. Lovers wrote verses in the margins of ledgers. Rebels sent blank pages with a single crease, folded in such a way that only the recipient would understand. The empire tried to stay ahead, but ink moves strangely. It stains fingers, it dries invisible and reappears when the paper warms. Even now, in museum collections, some letters are being reread, with ultraviolet light, with patience, with the hope of finding what was never delivered. Because the past, like the postal route, has detours, and truth is often waiting at the last stop. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, imagine a letter folded in silk, carried beneath a coat, held close to a heart that never stopped hoping. It may have never arrived, but it was written. And that sometimes is enough, because silence can delay a message, but it cannot erase its meaning. In a glass case, beneath gentle lights and beside polished swords that once hung in sultans' halls, rests a dagger. Short, curved and glimmering, untouched by rust, untouched by time. Its hilt is gold, inlaid with green stones. Its sheath is velvet, once black, now fading to midnight blue. A ceremonial weapon, the placard says, a gift between rulers. And that is all it says. But the dagger knows more. There is no record of its forging, no name of the artisan, no clear date, and yet every inch of it speaks of precision. It was meant to impress and possibly to wound. Its story does not lie in the steel, but in the silk it was wrapped in, and the silences that followed it. The blade was first given, it is believed, in the 18th century, from an Ottoman sultan to a foreign dignitary. Some say it was a French envoy, others whisper it was sent east to a rising ruler in the Persian court. It was a gesture of peace or flattery or both, a token beautifully useless, or so it seemed. But the dagger did not stay where it was sent. Within a few years it reappeared, not in a palace, but in a private collection. No note of return, no diplomatic exchange, stolen perhaps, gifted again, taken in the night when allegiances shifted like sand. What is known is that by the early 1800s, the dagger was seen again, in the hand of a man who had no right to hold it. A man known only in fragments, a courtier exiled under suspicion, a man who once advised a governor, then vanished from his post, a man who, legend says, kept the dagger beneath his robes, not as ornament, but as warning. It was rumoured he used it, once, in a narrow passage near the edge of the imperial gardens. The body was found, but the blade, wrapped in cloth, was never mentioned. The man fled. The dagger disappeared again. Years passed, and then, without ceremony, it returned, placed in the imperial treasury, unannounced, not reclaimed through battle, not offered with apology. It was simply there, wrapped tightly in silk, as if it had never left. No one claimed it, no one questioned it. It was catalogued under a vague heading: ceremonial blade, 18th century, unknown provenance. But the cloth it came wrapped in, that was not forgotten. It bore a faded emblem, a rose pierced by a needle. Not a known family crest, but to certain old eyes it meant something. The emblem belonged to a secretive society of court informants, men and women who passed messages not on paper, but in objects. They marked loyalty in layers of fabric, knots, embroidery, and the dagger's cloth was knotted in a way that meant he did not forget. Who he was, no one could say. The dagger was placed behind glass, not in the main display, but in a quiet corner, without story, without voice, because its presence raised questions the Empire preferred to leave unanswered. Had it been used? Why had it returned? Who decided it was safer to display it than to bury it? Some said it was cursed, that any man who held it with false loyalty would be undone. Others said it was harmless, just another ornament among hundreds. But its edges were never dulled, its sheath never opened in public. And no one, no matter how curious, ever removed it from the case. What makes this blade remarkable is not just its possible past, it's the way it was deliberately forgotten. Most objects in the imperial collection are proudly labelled, documented, studied. Even weapons from battles long lost carry a paragraph of honour. But this one is silent, too pristine to be ignored, too storied to be acknowledged. It lives in the liminal, a thing meant to remind someone of something, but not us. Even the cloth it arrived in was quietly removed, catalogued, then stored. Not destroyed, just set aside, folded into the archive of things we're not ready to translate. Because some objects speak in tones we can't quite name, and sometimes forgetting is not failure, it is strategy. The Empire understood this, that a dagger on display might say, "We remember what you did," or perhaps, "We know what you almost did." Tonight it remains behind glass. Its stones still gleam, its blade still shines, though no hand has polished it in years. Visitors pass, some pause, most walk by. They do not know the stories, but they feel the pause in the air, because certain objects hum, not with sound, but with memory. And memory, even when unspoken, is sharp. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, imagine a room where history is wrapped in velvet, a blade hidden in a robe, a gift turned threat, turned silence, and a cloth, folded carefully, to say nothing aloud, but everything in its knots. Some things are remembered too clearly to be spoken, so we display them quietly and call it peace. They marched in perfect lines, boots striking stone in unison, robes crisp, eyes forward, silence like iron. The Janissaries, elite soldiers of the Ottoman Empire, chosen not for their birthright, but for their transformation. Taken young, trained hard, taught loyalty, not as an idea, but as a command etched into muscle and marrow. They were the Empire's blade, unquestioning, unshaking, unseen, until it was too late. But no one asked what they saw. They were stationed in cities and fortresses, in palaces and provinces, in places where the Empire needed not just strength, but eyes. And those eyes noticed everything. They saw what the scribes didn't write, the quiet exchanges in courtyards. The servant dismissed too quickly, the noble who trembled at the mention of an envoy's name. They escorted letters and sometimes read them. They guarded treasuries and sometimes saw the gold go missing. They heard ministers speak with confidence by day and caution by candlelight. The Janissaries were trained in obedience, but awareness is a side effect of proximity, and over time, that awareness became dangerous. Because to serve the Empire is one thing. To understand it from within, its fractures, its whispers, its unspoken bargains, is another. Some turned their gaze away. They learned not to linger in the wrong room, not to ask why a general's carriage arrived late, not to wonder why a document was signed twice. They closed their eyes and tightened their grip on the sword. But others didn't. They remembered. They watched. They began to see. And once you see the seams in a tapestry, it's hard to pretend the pattern is perfect. In the early years, the Janissaries were fiercely loyal. They had no families, no property, no past. They belonged to the Sultan. His breath was their breath, his command their heartbeat. But time alters structure. By the 17th century, the Janissary Corps had changed. Many were no longer taken as boys. They came with memories, with ambitions. They formed alliances, gathered wealth, built influence. Some even entered politics. And suddenly the men trained to watch and guard began to act. A whispered warning to a merchant, a promise to protect a cleric in exchange for a favour. A quiet threat made without words in a hallway lit by a single torch. The Janissaries were still soldiers, but now they were also listeners, mediators, sometimes enforcers of their own interests. The empire noticed and worried, because a soldier with a sword is predictable. A soldier with knowledge is not. They were too close to the throne, too present in the shadows, too aware of which minister argued with which mother of which heir. They became both shield and mirror, and rulers do not always like their own reflection. There are stories, half recorded, half suspected, of Janissaries who saw too much. One stood watch outside a sultan's private chamber. He overheard an argument. The next morning, a high official was gone. No explanation. The Janissary was reassigned. 3 weeks later, his name was removed from the payroll. Another guarded the gates during a late-night delivery. No seal, no documentation. He asked a question. The courier went pale. The next day, the Janissary was sent to a remote outpost and never returned. Some, knowing the risk, chose silence. They became masters of detachment, polite, precise, forgetful by design, but not all. Some began to speak, not loudly, not in rebellion, just among themselves. A knowing glance in the barracks, a half joke at a tavern, a comment passed along to a friend who knew a friend who might be useful. And slowly, the corps became more than a military unit. It became a network, a presence, a power. They were still called slaves of the Sultan, but their influence grew, and with it, the danger. Because what happens when the eyes that guard the empire begin to judge it? By the 19th century, reformers within the Ottoman court saw the Janissaries as a threat, too powerful, too rooted, too unwilling to change. And so, in 1826, the empire made a decision, a final one. It was called the Auspicious Incident, a moment of calculated erasure. The Janissaries were summoned, then surrounded, then shelled. Thousands died. The corps was disbanded, its name scrubbed from the records, its traditions dissolved, but not its memory. Even now, their quarters in Istanbul stand, empty, echoing. The walls remember the rhythm of their boots. In museums, their uniforms are displayed, clean, distant, labelled. But their eyes, the way they once saw, still linger in the corners of history. Not because they held swords, but because they held truths, quiet ones, observed, never spoken, and never forgotten. Tonight, as you close your own eyes, think of a man standing guard at dusk. He sees something small, a pause, a slip, a change in tone. He does not speak, but he knows. And that knowledge, held in silence, may shape the next day more than any battle ever could. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing in an empire is the man who watches. Some documents are made to inform, some to persuade, but a few are made to frighten. In a sealed drawer, beneath other papers that posed no threat, grain ledgers, maintenance requests, routine correspondence, lay a single parchment, folded carefully, ink still sharp, as though written only yesterday. A list, a long one, more than 100 names, each line etched with the same weight. No ranks, no titles, no explanations. Just names, one after another, like a slow chant, like a roll call of silence. It named poets, it named scholars, it named palace cooks, street clerks, retired soldiers, bath attendants, distant relatives, all accused of the same thing. A thought, not a plan, not a conspiracy. A thought shared, suspected, or simply imagined. The document carried no seal of execution, no official decree, only a heading in elegant Ottoman script, persons under observation. It was found decades later when an archivist cleared out a forgotten chest. A folded cloth protected it from time. The ink remained dark, the parchment crisp, untouched by mould or sunlight. The list was too old to be relevant, and yet too dangerous to forget. No date, no author, no context, only that the names were real. Some were already known. A poet exiled for writing too beautifully about justice. A merchant imprisoned for irregular accounting, though none could find an error. But others were surprising. A palace gardener, a scribe's apprentice, a midwife. Names with no record of descent. Just ordinary people, pulled into extraordinary suspicion. Historians would later note that some of the names appeared in unrelated trials. Others vanished from payrolls around the same time. A few were promoted, curiously fast, then disappeared. The list, it seemed, was not just a record, it was a map of fear, of quiet punishment, of warnings that left no trace except in the lives they interrupted. And yet, the list survived. Why? It could have been destroyed, burned, torn, misplaced, but it was kept, not displayed, not cited, just preserved, as though someone believed it might still be needed. Perhaps to remind, perhaps to threaten, perhaps because no one dared decide what should happen to it. One line scrawled faintly at the bottom, in a different hand read, "Do not read aloud." No signature, no reason, just the instruction. And that, more than anything, made the parchment shiver with weight. Because names, once spoken aloud, have power. To read them is to admit their presence, to acknowledge that someone somewhere believed they were dangerous. And once you speak a name, you cannot pretend you never saw it. So the parchment remained folded. It passed between archivists, scholars, and cautious administrators, each one opening it with gloves, each one pausing, each one closing it again. Not because they disagreed with it, but because they didn't know what it might awaken. Empires do not always need evidence. Sometimes suspicion is enough, and a list like this, even if it was never acted upon, could unravel more than it confirmed. What if someone's grandfather had been on that list? What if a beloved poet, long honoured, had once been considered untrustworthy? What if the line between loyalty and betrayal was thinner than ink? And worse still, what if the list had been right? There is no record of how the names were gathered. No notes, no reports, no testimonies, only the list. But someone wrote it. Someone decided whose thoughts were too dangerous. And someone decided that thought, invisible and unprovable, could be recorded like a fact. The empire at its peak kept many lists, census records, tax rolls, military assignments. But this list felt different. It didn't track wealth or service, it tracked possibility. The possibility that a word spoken in the wrong room, a glance held too long, a poem read with the wrong inflection could mean allegiance to something else. We will never know if the names were ever read by the Sultan, if ministers debated their fates, or if the parchment sat quietly, untouched, a secret known only to the man who wrote it. But its silence echoes. Because in the empire, as in all great powers, not every danger carried a sword. Some carried a metaphor, a verse, a question asked at the wrong time, and that was enough. Even today the parchment exists, preserved, restricted, rarely shown, never transcribed. Not for legal reasons, not for lack of interest, but because reading it would demand a reckoning with the past, with the idea that names, simple names, once carried enough weight to be feared, but not enough to be remembered. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine a table in a quiet room. A candle flickers, a man leans over a blank sheet and begins to write. Not stories, not judgments, just names, one by one, each letter, a decision, each space between names, a life changed. He folds the page, wraps it in cloth, and walks away. He does not need to explain, because the list, once written, already speaks, and some words once spoken cannot be unspoken. Not all endings are written with thunder. Some arrive in silence, gradual, deliberate, and self-made. In its final years, the Ottoman Empire did not go out with a shout, but with a gesture, a drawer closed, a fire lit in the corner of a record room, a door to an archive quietly locked and never reopened. It did not want pity. It did not want examination. It wanted dignity. And so it began the erasure of itself piece by piece. Some documents were shredded, not in rage but in resignation. Names crossed out, ledgers burned, treaties redacted, entire branches of correspondence removed from shelves and carried away under cover of dusk. The empire, long master of recording everything, every tax, every birth, every grain sold from every port, now chose to forget. Because memory, in the wrong hands, is weight. And in collapse, weight is dangerous. There were rooms filled with maps, not just of land but of power. Who ruled where? Who rebelled when? What was promised, then denied? Many of those maps vanished. Some were taken by foreign diplomats. Some were hidden in private homes. Some were destroyed by the very people who had drawn them. A governor once said to a clerk, as they boxed up files near the Syrian border, "If they ask tomorrow who we were, let the wind answer." It was not shame, it was strategy. Because empires are not only destroyed by outside force, sometimes they dissolve from within, with elegance, with an instinct for self-preservation that sounds like silence. The Ottomans, by the early 20th century, had been at the centre of the world for 6 centuries. They had ruled over dozens of languages, faiths, landscapes, wars, but by 1918 they were exhausted. And in exhaustion, they did not cling to every relic they released. Palace inventories were revised, journals were misplaced, letters between sultans and their ministers were deemed redundant. In one case, a cache of correspondence between the palace and a rebel tribe was ordered burned, not because it was false, PR, but because it was true and inconvenient. They wanted the ending to feel graceful, as if centuries of rule could be folded like a robe and placed in a cedar chest, not to be worn again, but to be remembered kindly. But silence is never absolute. Whispers slipped out, not through proclamations, but through absence. A scholar requested a record, only to be told it had never existed. A court ledger was discovered with whole months missing. A collection of imperial photographs was found, faces scratched out by hand. The empire, in its waning days, tried to curate its own memory, not through monuments, but through editing. Let the next world remember the grandeur, the calligraphy, the gardens. Let them forget the prisons, the betrayals, the negotiations made under threat. And yet, something in the ink resists vanishing. A document partially burned still carries meaning in its margins. A journal page, torn in half, still whispers what was feared. A census with gaps reminds us who was meant to be invisible. The act of erasure leaves a fingerprint, and those fingerprints tell a story, not of facts but of fear, because only a nervous empire hides itself. Only a ruler who knows the curtain is falling begins folding it before the audience leaves. There are record from foreign observers, from dissenters, from forgotten scribes, of files removed from shelves in the final days, of trunks sealed with wax and never opened again, of fires in basements burning slowly through dusk, their smoke too faint to raise alarm. In one account, a librarian was asked what was being destroyed. She replied, "Nothing important, only memory." And yet, what is more important than that? Even now, there are missing years, decades with few surviving personal letters, periods where entire departments seem to vanish from the record. Historians call it the fog, not imposed from outside, but conjured from within. And it worked, for a time. The empire vanished, a republic rose, and with it a new story, one that looked forward, one that rarely looked back. But silence does not last forever. Years later, A drawer is opened, a photograph is found. A diary appears at auction, yellowed but defiant. And suddenly, the quiet is interrupted. Not rudely, not violently, just completely. Because the past, however carefully hidden, does not agree to stay buried. It waits, in cloth, in corners, in the heartbeat of a phrase once spoken and never written. And in that waiting, it remembers. The empire may have chosen silence, but history, like a tide, always returns to shore. Tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine a man alone in a stone room. He holds a sheaf of papers. He reads them one last time. Then without a word, he drops them into the flames. Not out of hate, not out of fear, but because he believes forgetting will protect the future. What he does not know is that even ash leaves outlines, and some truths once hidden grow louder, because silence is never absolute. Not everything fades completely. Even the forgotten leave behind echoes, soft, weightless, waiting. In the dust of old rooms, in the thin light that filters through shuttered windows, the Ottoman Empire breathes its last through what remains. Not in decrees or monuments, but in smaller things. A sealed letter without a recipient, a book with no borrower's name, a drawer that sticks as if it remembers a hand that used to open it daily. History is not made only in grand halls. Sometimes it settles in corners, quiet and undecided. After the empire fell, the world turned its gaze to what came next: reform, revolution, modernity. But beneath the noise of change, a softer layer persisted, the traces left behind. A ledger in a market office stopped mid-sentence, ink frozen at the word tahsilat, collection. No punctuation, no signature, just a pen stroke trailing off, like breath held too long. A storage chest opened decades later, revealing children's slippers made for a prince who never wore them, wrapped in tissue, unworn but carefully preserved. The name tag tied with ribbon, faded but still legible. He had died before they could be gifted. A letter addressed to a woman whose name no longer appears in any census. The envelope sealed, never opened. Inside, a single pressed flower and a line of verse copied from an old Turkish poem. My heart, though stilled, listens still. These were not the relics of power. They were the remnants of living. And they remained not because they were meant to, but because no one had the heart to throw them away. Dust gathered over time, on ledgers, on uniforms, on unclaimed medals, but dust does not destroy. It preserves softly. It covers, but it does not erase. Archivists in Istanbul still speak of a locked drawer in an old office. Inside, a hair comb, a pocket watch, and a key labelled simply Cabinet B removed. No one knows what Cabinet B was. There is no record of its contents, only the key remains. A historian once found a book tucked behind a shelf. A ledger of poetry, purchases made by palace staff. A maid had once bought a copy of Rumi's verses. A stable boy, a collection of Sufi wisdom. A cook, 5 copies of the same romantic tale, one for each of her sisters. These purchases were not recorded in official histories, but they speak, quietly, of people who lived through empire not as rulers, but as hearts. In the dust we do not find law, we find longing. A note folded into a prayer rug, never sent. If the child survives, name him for the wind. A shoe marked with a stitched crescent moon, a style out of favour even before the empire ended, but worn proudly by an old man who had served 5 sultans and asked for nothing. We find fingerprints on the edge of pages, a coffee stain on the margin of a military report, a napkin embroidered with initials no one recognises, but the stitching is careful, done with love. These small traces hold no headline, but they are the breath of something once vast. Because when empires fall, it is not the battles or treaties that echo longest. It is the people, the lives wrapped inside. the moments too quiet to archive, the objects too ordinary to frame. They remain in attics, in trunks, in shoeboxes passed down without full explanation. A child asks her grandmother, "Whose handwriting is this?" And the answer comes slowly. "No one famous, just your great aunt. She used to write songs we weren't supposed to sing." The child hums one. It doesn't rhyme anymore, but the tune remains. What is it that lingers in the dust? Grief, yes, but also gentleness. A softness the empire couldn't stamp out. A tailor's note on the back of a tax form. Too many uniforms. Not enough joy. A palace recipe, amended in the margin. Add rosewater only if the guest is grieving. The empire ruled with structure, but what remains is feeling. And feelings don't vanish, they wait. They settle gently into time's folds. Sometimes a museum. Catalogue notes an item as unidentified. A scrap of fabric, a wooden carving, a string of beads with no clear origin. But someone once held them. Someone thought they mattered. And perhaps that is enough. We do not need to know every story. We only need to know they existed. Tonight, as you rest, imagine a room long closed, a thin veil of dust upon the shelves, light seeping in through wooden shutters, and on a desk, a sealed letter, a book never returned, a name written in the corner of a forgotten photograph. These things are waiting, not to be glorified, not to be corrected, just to be seen. Because even when an empire hides itself, even when its grandest memories are wrapped in silence, somewhere in the dust, something tender lingers.